please present yourself?
Sure. My name is Mareike Schomerus, and I have just started to set up a new research consortium at the London School of Economics, which is called the Justice and Security Research Programme.
Thank you. Now, I understand that today's conference was about democratic changes in Central Africa. How come that you're interested in what is happening in Africa in terms of politics?
I do a lot of research work specifically in South Sudan, and I've done research work since the signing of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement in 2005, and of course that is one of the documents that initiated one of these great democratic transitions that we're witnessing. And today's conference really looked at 3 democratic transitions. I don't know if we can call them changes yet. I don't even know if we can call them democratic transitions, but maybe just transitions. And specifically the 3 countries that we looked at here today with 3 speakers were Rwanda and Uganda, and then indeed South Sudan, which obviously in the last year has gone through 2 great democratic rituals, at least the elections and then the referendum on independence.
Okay, thank you very much. Do you think that there is any hope that we're going to have a pure democratic system in a country like Uganda, for instance?
Well, I don't know if we should ever think about pure democratic systems. I don't know which country in the world would possibly qualify to having a pure democratic system. I just don't think it's possible to think about democracy in that way. Somebody today said democracy is always in transition. That's by definition what democracy does. And I think maybe it's quite useful to actually take away these categories a little bit when we think about these processes in Central Africa. Because if we think about them as democratic transitions, we run into a danger of having sort of a checklist and a to-do list of things that need to happen for certain changes to occur. And I don't know whether that's very useful, because that also takes us away from a deeper understanding of what actually happens in these processes. If we look at elections and we think, well, if an election happens, then we have a very strong democratic process, that of course is very, very misleading, and that we've seen in many, many countries in the world that has nothing to do one with the other. So it's very difficult to say where these processes go. I think it's important to understand that we look at how people power develops, how people express their political opinions and their political voices, even outside the electoral process. And then also I think it's very important to look at how government power evolves and what governments do to facilitate these processes that we vaguely understand as democratic, or indeed what governments do to avoid them and to stay in power. And I think the really interesting question, the really interesting thing to observe over the next few years is in the tension between the two, rather than trying to attain as you called it, some sort of purely democratic state, because frankly I don't know where in the world we would find one.
Thank you. Now, if you look at the Western democratic countries, you'll see that they went through certain transitions, and some of the transitions were not very pleasant. A lot of wars in Western Europe in the past. Do you think that Africa today has undergone the same process and to have any foundation for any democratic system? Or we are maybe being very premature to expect some democratic system in Central Africa?
Again, I think it's maybe dangerous to compare the two, because it makes it sound as if for a system to be established in which the majority of the people feels that their voice is being heard and that they're being represented, we need to sort of climb a step ladder. And if we take then the history of Western Europe, for example, the step ladder would then mean wars need to happen, and then some sort of dictatorship needs to be overthrown, and then this is how the process happens. And then elections are the next point on the step ladder, and then somehow we do have a democratic country.
If I may say, you see, if you look, for instance, what's happening in Egypt, we had, for instance, revolutions in Europe, the French Revolution and so on. We are having something happening in Egypt. So could you maybe refer to what is happening in the Middle East?
In the Arab Spring.
And then you can see if we have the condition which can be a foundation of democratic systems in Central Africa.
Yeah, I mean, looking at the Arab Spring and what's happening right now in the Arab world is really interesting, because it kind of illustrates my point that we don't actually really know the exact steps that we need to take in order to establish a democratic system, because really nobody predicted this. Nobody thought, well, the next step for Egypt will be people camping out on Tahrir Square and just pushing for a change. Nobody knew this. So this was not how democracy was predicted. So it's very, very difficult for us to say we need to make these steps certain, these steps will certainly lead to a change change in Central Africa. I think there's a real concern if governments become violent toward their people, and if this happens within the electoral process or outside the electoral process, the concern stays the same. And that, I think, is maybe something we need to focus on. When do these processes become violent and actually very, very damaging towards people? But what exactly the process is that each country has to go through to reach a level of, I don't even know how to put it, acceptable democracy, we simply don't know. It would be very difficult to predict, because then we arrive exactly at the problem that's always criticized, which is that we take one overarching cookie-cutter approach and try to put it into place everywhere else. Just because it happened to work somewhere once, that doesn't necessarily mean that it will improve the lives of people in other contexts. And I always think that a political system that is genuinely oriented towards its people should aim to make sure that it improves the life of the people living under the political system, and that it protects them.
Thank you. Now, if you look at some of the presidents, like in Uganda, in Rwanda, they are being really supported by the West. And people in those countries are still complaining that they don't have any democracy. Why is the West having what we call selective support towards democracy?
Why is the West having selective support towards democracy? That's a very big question, and I really don't want to speak as the West here, because of course that's the question that people always criticize, that the standards seem to be rather fluid, that donors apply in supporting certain leadership and certain political systems, with maybe the calculation that things would change further down the line, or indeed with completely different calculations, which have nothing to do whatsoever with establishing an accountable political system. I think it would be very useful to look into this in more detail in each particular case and be quite honest about this, and have a very detailed analysis that actually shows how these relationships between donor countries and receiving countries and conditions that are attached to receiving donor money and political processes actually work. Because in many ways I think the argument could be made that it's very easy for the West to say, well, we're supporting these so-called democratization processes in other countries. It takes away a little bit of intention and a little bit of pressure from themselves at home as well, where very often things aren't that rosy either. So it's very, I always think about it as one big grey mess of people scrambling for various power positions and trying to find the best space for themselves, which again is essentially really what human beings are like, right?
Thank you. Do you think the West is ready for democracy in Central Africa?
Is the West ready for democracy in Central Africa? I find that very difficult to answer, because I'm not entirely sure that I would know what democracy in Central Africa would really look like. Because I associate the system, the political system of democracy, with a constituency that is able to make informed decisions. To be able to make informed decisions, people need to be able to get information, they need to be able to consume information, and that is very, very difficult in countries where education levels are very, very low. So I always tend to think that actually it might be more useful for us to think about, well, what makes somebody a politically responsible citizen? Certainly it's education, and it's the ability to live a political life, which means you need to be healthy, you need to have enough to eat, you need to have clean water and all these kind of things. So I'm not sure that the political system I would put as the biggest goal to achieve first, and then everything else follows. I think it might just have to be the other way around.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.